The Ancient Kingdoms of Peru by Nigel Davies. Chapter 6. The Rise of the Incas. The last pre-Hispanic era in the history of the Central Andes is that of the Inca Empire. Initially a small tribe of uncertain origins that had settled in the valley of Cusco, their conquests dwarfed those of earlier Andean peoples and are more comparable in extent to those of the great empires of the Old World. In the period between the fall of Wari and the rise of the Inca, from about 81,000 to 1400, while the kingdom of Timor dominated the north coast, smaller maritime principalities flourished further to the south. Conspicuous among these was Ichima, situated astride the Lima Valley. Remains of its principal city, Cajamarquilla, still survive in a suburb of present-day Lima. Yet further to the south, the Inca and Nazca peoples continued to weave fine textiles and produce distinctive forms of pottery. In highland Peru, however, a certain power vacuum seems to have existed in the post-Wari era. For instance, the valley of Cusco itself was inhabited by peoples who lived in hilltop settlements and produced a pottery known as quilca. Fairly recent excavations tell us that Picalacta, the great Wari site situated within the valley of Cusco, was abandoned long before the Inca era. Due to the absence of any writing system and to a paucity of post-conquest texts in their native Quechua, much of our knowledge of the Inca past stems from Spanish conquistadors and chroniclers. Their reports initially had little impact on the non-Spanish world. It was not long, however, before the Incas began to attract a wider audience. Descriptions of a veritable mountain of silver discovered by the Spaniards at Potosi, in the Bolivian Altiplano, enriched the legend of a remote and mysterious El Dorado, famed for its riches. Soon, dramatic stories of the Spanish absorption of the Inca realm and of the tenacious native resistance began to spread, and written reports began to circulate in Italy and France, replete with tales of Peruvian wealth, exemplified by the huge ransom of pure gold offered to the conqueror Pizarro by the fallen emperor Atahualpa. As early as 1534, a broadsheet was printed at Lyon entitled Novelas Certenas de Islas de Peru. In the 17th century, writers such as Locke in England and Spinoza in Holland began to extol the primitive realms of the American Indians, and in particular those of Peru. The notion of the noble savage, applied originally more to the natives of Brazil, took firm hold in the imagination of the French 18th century philosophers, stimulated by reports of a great kingdom centered upon the high Andes and endowed with fabulous riches. Voltaire chose Lima as the setting of his Alzire, an extremely successful play. His most famous work, Candide, published in 1759, offered an idealized account of an El Dorado whose denizens were supposedly descended from the Incas. The work of Jean-François Momontel, Les Incas ou la Destruction de Peru, dedicated to King Gustav III of Sweden, was published in 1777. The action, mainly concerned with the fate of the Atahualpa, aided by refugees from the fallen kingdom of the Aztec Moctezuma, takes place in Quito. In marked contrast to such exotic tales, William Prescott in the 1840s published his Conquest of Peru. Using Spanish sources already published, he related his stately prose, the epic of the Conquest of Peru, beginning with the bizarre story of the Spaniards' first meeting with the Inca Atahualpa. In the early 20th century, Peru began to attract an increasing number of authors of a different kind. No longer romanticized as greedy and gaudy capitalists solely obsessed with the hoarding of gold, the Incas were now more often portrayed as the world's first socialists, and at times even described as communists. More recently, the Incas and their predecessors have been the subject of intensive study by scholars of many lands, whose work has produced spectacular results, even if much still remains to be done. Humble origins. In contrast to the more grandiloquent accounts of their triumphs and tragedies, the story of the humble origins of the Incas is more diffuse. The Spanish chroniclers generally concur in naming as their creator god Chichi Viracocha, a deity linked in legend with the shores of Lake Titicaca. Among the most vivid descriptions of Inca origins is that of Juan de Betanzos. He relates that the creator, Chichi Viracocha, at a time when all was still dark, ruled over certain people whose name no one recalls. The god then emerged from Lake Titicaca, killed these shadowy beings who had somehow offended him and turned them into stone. Arising once more from the lake, he created the sun and moon, and thereafter fashioned new beings, some of whom were pregnant women. These he dispatched to different destinations, including Cusco. While Viracocha is more usual appellation, the Inca creator is sometimes associated with Pachacamac, meaning world creator in Quechua, who was the patron deity of the famed coastal shrine of that name. However, the locus for the act of creation is essentially Lake Titicaca. Among the Aymara peoples of that region, their thunder god, Tunapa, was also worshipped as a primordial deity. In Andean cosmogony, there is little emphasis on the creation of the world ex nihilo, as related, for instance, in the book of Genesis. Chroniclers preferred to write of tutelary gods who proceeded to create humankind in the world that already existed. Though often described as lacking sun and moon, a feature reminiscent of Mexican legends already known to the Spaniards. In one such Andean version of the first beings are turned into black cats, in another to monkeys. Only subsequently was the human race created, including, of course, the Incas. Hence, surviving Spanish accounts deal less with the primordial creation of man on another continent than with events when humans already lived in the Andean region, an omission that is hardly surprising. For Spanish chroniclers, imbued with the marvel of God's creation of the world as described in their own scriptures, it would have been a blatant heresy to accept any notion of a second creation in the New World, complete with its own Adam and Eve, living in an Andean version of the Garden of Eden. Thus, it needs to be stressed that we have a dual cycle of origin myths, one of which centers upon Lake Titicaca and the ancient site of Tiwanaku, and is based upon the creation, in fact a second creation, of the sun and moon, and stresses the role of the creator Viracocha. But in addition to such myths, what amounts to an alternative version tells how the first Inca ruler, Manco Capac, emerged from Lake Titicaca and thence traveled literally underground to the cave of Pacaric Tambo in the valley of Cusco. In the view of the sanctity of ancient fables related to the shores of Lake Titicaca in pre-Inca times, any links with such traditions gave added legitimacy to Inca claims to conquer other peoples. Somewhat paradoxically, the identity of Pacaric Tambo, a focal point of the Inca myths associated with the valley of Cusco, is far from clear, since Gary Urton has demonstrated that the present-day town of that name did not come into existence until 1571. Moreover, the true date of the appearance of the Incas in the valley of Cusco remains uncertain. Following excavations in 1994 and 1995 at Choquepuquio, 27 kilometers southeast of Cusco, Gordon McEwen views the pre-Inca culture of Quilca as ending in about AD 1200 and treats the site as Inca rather than pre-Inca from AD 1200 onwards. While scientific evidence may thus advance the possibility of an earlier Inca presence, chroniclers offer a fairly uniform version of the appearance of this exiguous band of Incas in the valley of Cusco at an implicitly later date. Their story can be summarized as follows. When they emerged eventually from the cave of Pacaritambo to the southeast of Cusco, their leader, Manco, was accompanied by 3 brothers, each with his sister wife. As they proceeded on their way, one brother, Ayarcachi, was introduced to enter a cave to retrieve some golden cups. A godlike figure of prodigious strength, he could cast stones that would level whole hills. But after Cachi entered the cave, his brothers proceeded to bar the entrance. Thus trapped, he was turned to stone and his huaca became one of the most holy objects in Inca ritual. The countless sacred stones, known as huacas, scattered throughout the Inca realm, played a major role in their cosmogony, as we shall later see. After Manco and his band had reached Huanacauri, a hill some 13 kilometers from Cusco, a second brother, Ayauchu, was also transformed into a stone huaca. The third brother, Ayarauca, reportedly then grew wings and was ordered to take flight and proceed ahead of Manco to Cusco. When he alighted there, he became the community stone called Cusco Huaca, the field guardian of the city. Having disposed of his brothers, Manco, unchallenged by rivals, proceeded to Cusco accompanied by his sister wife and by those of his 3 brothers. Accounts imply that the site was already occupied and described hostile encounters between Incas and peoples known as Hualas and Alcavizas. The small band of Incas held their ground and established themselves in the triangle between the Tulomayo and Huatanay rivers, where Manco reportedly built the first Coricancha temple. The early rulers. Having outlined what are in effect legendary accounts of the foundation of Cusco, in this chapter a summary follows of what we learned from the chroniclers of Inca history prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. The 2 following chapters are devoted to other aspects of the brief, a spectacular period of Inca achievements such as their cities, including Cusco, their lifestyle, and above all their system of control over the huge empire which they conquered. The chroniclers mainly concur as to the names of the first 7 Inca kings, listed as follows by John Rowe: Manco Capac, Sinchiroca, Loque Yupanqui, Maita Capac, Capac Yupanqui, Inca Roca, Yawar Huaca. A few writers, such as Garcilasco de la Vega, credit these rather nebulous early rulers with spectacular conquests. According to this chronicler, the 3rd king, Loque Yupanqui, had already advanced into the province of Culao, situated on the shores of Lake Titicaca, while the fourth, Mayta Capac, occupied the ancient site of Tiwanaku and thereafter subdued the Arequipa region. Earlier 20th century writers on Inca history, such as Clement Markham, tend to accept this version of events. Philip Ainsworth Means, whose Ancient Civilizations of the Andes was published in 1931, not only treated as fully historical the orthodox list of early rulers, but stretched their chronology, crediting them with the conquest of the Lake Titicaca region in about AD 1200. It might be added that while certain scholars now tend to view that the Incas' arrival in the valley of Cusco much earlier than the chroniclers' account might imply, they do not suggest that at such a stage, they made far-reaching conquests. Notwithstanding a few reports of spectacular triumphs, most accounts are vague and contradictory to a point that it becomes hard to offer a historical version of this early Inca period reign by reign. Of Manco's successor, Chinchi Roca, almost nothing of note is recorded, while the third ruler, Loque Yupanqui, is generally portrayed as pacific or inactive. The fourth king, Mayta Capac, reportedly clashed with the Alcavisas, described as natives of Cusco, thereby implying that the Incas were not the first to occupy that place and that their hold was as yet partial and tenuous. This tribe allegedly assaulted the Incas when Mayta Capac's father still reigned and reached the walls of Coricancha, their sacred stronghold. Several accounts offer a confused tale of how the Alcavisas dispatched 10 Indians with the intention of killing Mayta Capac and his father, Loque Yupanqui, who was still king at the time, in their abode in Coricancha. Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa relates that the prince, Mayta Capac, killed one of the 10 Indians by hurling a ball with which he was playing at the time. The others immediately fled. Thereafter, a magic hailstorm, more devastating than Mayta's well-aimed missile, put the Alcavisas to flight. The prince soon ascended the throne, but apparently then ruled peacefully and fought no more wars. The sixth ruler, Inca Roca, is generally named as the first to divide Cusco into Hanan Upper and Urin Lower Cusco. Henceforth, the rulers no longer lived in the temple enclosure of Coricancha, situated in Urin, but each built his palace in Hanan, Cusco. The division of Andean cities into upper and lower halves, which still persists in certain instances today, became widespread in Inca times, if not before, and occurred in places as distant from one another as Puno on Lake Titicaca, the Cañari region of Ecuador, and the ancient cities of the south coast of Peru. Even the Chancas, who as we shall see went on to become the Incas' implacable foes, were divided into Urin and Anan Chanca, each with its own ruler. As also became the case in Cusco, Anan was the more dominant of the two. In the Inca capital, while the rulers who succeeded Inca Roca built their palaces in Anan, Urin nonetheless retained a certain prestige as the residence of the religious hierarchy based upon Coricancha. Among the inveterate foes of the early Inca rulers was another group, the Ayamacas, against whom many chroniclers write of warlike encounters with the Incas during the reign of Inca Roca. Foremost among these is the report of the abduction by the Ayamacas of Roca's son and heir, Yaguarhuaca. Sequestered when only a child, he was forced by his captors to serve as a simple herdsman for a whole year. Then after a hard-fought battle, the prince was rescued and the rift between Incas and Ayamacas was at least temporarily healed by a double marriage between their ruling houses. John Rowe, who may be regarded as the pioneer of modern Peruvian ethnohistory, poses the question as to whether the 7 rulers who preceded the 8th, Viracocha Inca, made any real conquests. He concludes that the supposed triumphs of these kings were probably little more than raids, and that the same localities tended to be repeatedly lost and regained in successive reigns. However, Rowe opines that nonetheless, even if their hold on the surrounding region was tenuous, the first 7 Inca rulers named in the text may have achieved at least a certain primacy over their nearest neighbors, though not the capacity to exact regular tribute. At first sight, one may be tempted to agree with these scholars who dismiss the rather nebulous story of these 7 monarchs as mere fiction. But in the final instance, if these monarchs were expunged from the record as pure figures of fable, then one has to replace them with anonymous leaders, and to credit the latter with more or less the same achievements, namely the feat of securing over the course of a few generations of a certain degree of control over the valley of Cusco, as a prelude to the spectacular achievements of their successors. These 7 early rulers might perhaps be compared with the Albany king list, which, by a most curious coincidence, also consists of 7 shadowy monarchs who ruled before Rome became a conquest state, whose existence it may now be fashionable to deny, and whose principal function, whether legendary or historical, was to bridge the gap between the fall of Troy and the foundation of Rome. Myth and history. Given the nebulous nature of accounts of the early kings, the obvious question then arises as to the sources available for the study of the more dynamic period of Inca expansion that followed. In the absence of any body of pre-Hispanic documents or of post-conquest accounts written in the native Quechua, attempts to provide a history of the Inca rise to power present inevitable problems, and many doubts remain unresolved. As we have seen, 16th and 17th century writing on the Incas was mainly the preserve of chroniclers writing in Spanish, in contrast to Mexico, where pre-Hispanic pictorial codices survive, as well as copious documentation in the Nahuatl language provided by informants soon after the conquest. Most of our data, with the exception of the illustrated texts of Juan Poma de Ayala, whose copious illustrations with written descriptions of the Incas and their conquerors are unique in their detailed portrayal of those involved, thus derive from purely Spanish sources. While the opinions of their authors may differ, they tend to describe Inca society from a European viewpoint. These chroniclers gleaned their data from oral traditions passed from one Inca generation to another. Much of their information derives from the elite of Cusco and therefore reflects more the state system of the capital than the situation of the empire as a whole. Lacking written texts that predate the arrival of the Spaniards in Peru, it becomes hard to judge how far events recorded in the chroniclers are truly historical. Accounts of the acts of Inca kings may at times merely represent purely Spanish interpretations of the Inca hierarchy, based on European notions of kingship and in particular on European principles of dynastic succession. The Incas, while they had no writing system in the accepted sense of the word, did have an excellent method of recording certain data. The quipu knotted cords that served as an elaborate method of keeping records. The quipu was a single cord to which were attached strings, some of which ran parallel, while others sprang from a common starting point. By means of knots and distinctive colors, these strings could express both numbers and meaning. Paradoxically, however, few if any of the copious quipu data seem to have reached the Spanish chroniclers, though the latter at times referred to the quipu comayos, the highly skilled specialists who managed the quipu system. Existing quipus, taken mainly from cemeteries, cannot today be related to the objects with which they were buried. These surviving quipus, found mainly in the desert regions of the coast, separated from persons and artifacts after their removal from graves, were dispatched individually or in mixed bundles to different museums. Hence, the work of an individual quipu comayo becomes impossible to identify. We do know that the quipu served to compile such vital statistics as crop yields and storage capacity, as well as to record data on manpower, basic to military planning. Following the Spanish conquest, quipus were still used to compile data on the damage done to crops and homes in places where Spanish forces had passed. Had the demand arisen, the quipu system could surely have served admirably to record other information, such as the precise length of each ruler's reign. Unfortunately, however, the Incas' interest in their dynastic chronology seems to have been minimal. Hence, quipus offer no information on such matters. The Spaniards who actually took part in the conquest form a unique category of information. As eyewitnesses, they offer vivid portrayals of Inca life and ritual of which, however, they understood little. For instance, one may cite the riveting account by Francisco de Chedes of the first meeting between Atahualpa and his captor Francisco Pizarro. Chedes even gives a detailed description of the ruler's house in Cajamarca. He also wrote of the great temple of Pachacamac when he visited it, when it still functioned as a center of pilgrimage. One major problem for modern scholars is the fact that two of the most detailed and systematic accounts of Inca history, those of Sarmiento de Gamboa and of Cabello de Balboa, were both written many decades after the conquest, at a time when few eyewitness informants were still alive. As we shall later see in more detail, their versions, while differing in certain aspects, draw much information from one or more common sources. Sarmiento's history was commissioned by the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo and completed in 1572. His work, based on meticulous research, was nonetheless somewhat biased against the Incas since Toledo aimed to establish that the Incas were mere usurpers rather than the rightful owners of the vast domain that they ruled at the time of the conquest. Much of Cabello's narrative, written in 1586, clearly follows that of Sarmiento, while describing in more vivid detail the protracted and savage Inca wars against the tribes of Ecuador, where Cabello himself had lived. In contrast to these chroniclers, the Comentarios Reales of Garcilasco de la Vega, published in Lisbon in 1609, offer a vigorous apologia of Inca conquest. The author himself was of Inca lineage, though he quotes earlier chroniclers verbatim. His portrayal of his Inca forebears as kindly despots presiding over a vast welfare state, acquired with a minimum display of force, tends to be treated nowadays with some circumspection. Nearly half a century later, in 1663, Father Bernardo Cobo wrote his Historia del Nuevo Mundo. Using all the sources then available, his cogent and valuable appraisal is more that of an historian rather than a chronicler. A much earlier and somewhat more pragmatic portrayal of Inca achievement is given by Cieza de Leon. His viewpoint is generally pro-Inca without, like Garcilasco, attempting to idealize their rule. Cieza first traveled through Colombia and Ecuador before arriving in 1548 in Peru. His account offers information supplied mainly by the Inca nobility. Among such earlier chroniclers, Juan de Betanzos, who married a daughter of Atahualpa and who spoke fluent Quechua, was well placed to record the Inca version of their own traditions. While the work of a few such authors was published relatively early, many others lay buried for centuries. The Señorío de los Incas of Cieza de Leon was first printed in 1880. Sarmiento's history, finely bound, was sent to King Philip II. The manuscript eventually reached the library of the University of Göttingen in 1785, but remained unpublished until 1906. Part of the work of Betanzos was already known, but his full text was first discovered in the 1980s in Mallorca and published in 1987 in Madrid. Certain other chroniclers merit special attention. Polo de Ondegardo, a distinguished jurist, offers valuable information on social matters. He wrote in the 1560s and 1570s. He is much cited by Bernardo Cobo. In fairly recent times, our knowledge of the Andean past has been enriched by the publication of a whole series of visitas made by Spanish administrative inspectors to imperial provinces. Prominent among them is the visita of Garcia Diaz de San Miguel, made in 1567, to the Aymara province of Chucuito, and the 1562 visita of Oñigo Ortiz de Zúñiga to Huanaco. Pachacutec. Viracocha, the eighth ruler, and his heir Pachacutec, may at least claim to be historical figures in contrast to the 7 earlier kings mentioned above, whom some treat as authentic rulers, while for others they belong more to the realm of fiction. Leading chroniclers, such as Sarmiento, attribute this eighth ruler, Viracocha, the conquest or reconquest of places near Cusco that had been reportedly taken by former rulers and later abandoned after they had rebelled. According to such writers, Viracocha not only consolidated Inca control of Cusco itself, but made more distant conquests than his predecessors. But accounts of Viracocha's achievements are at times so nebulous as to prompt leading scholars, such as Maria Wojciechowski, to question whether he existed at all, and to suggest that Viracocha and his heir, Pachacutec, might have been one and the same person. Even assuming that Viracocha was indeed a historical personage, his reign is often described in terms that savor of legend as much as fact. Garcilasco de la Vega, in particular, offers a wholly different version of events, insisting that it was Viracocha rather than his son Pachacutec who fought and defeated the Chancas, a triumph which, as we shall see, was the turning point in Inca history. According to Garcilasco, Viracocha, having crushed the Chancas, launched ambitious campaigns and covered a vast realm, and conquered a vast realm. In other words, many of the more spectacular achievements of Pachacutec are merely transposed backwards in time by this author and attributed to his father. Many chroniclers concur in describing Pachacutec as Viracocha's legitimate son and heir, and hence as the ninth ruler. Certain accounts, however, confuse the issue by stating that Urco, an illegitimate son of Viracocha, was this ruler's personal choice as successor. Cieza de Leon even states that Urco actually reigned for a short time before being deposed by Pachacutec and then murdered. The Chanca that had apparently already risen before Pachacutec's accession. So little is known of them that one can only speculate as to their origins. At all events, in the more standard versions of the story, they had in the earlier part of Viracocha's reign occupied the region of Andahuaylas, lying to the west of the valley of Cusco, a feat which brought them to within striking distance of Inca-dominated territory. The Chancas did not, however, penetrate the valley of Cusco itself until Viracocha was already an old man. At this stage, however, fear of these intruders provoked such terror that many Incas abandoned all hope of resistance. Among these was the aged Viracocha, who fled from Cusco accompanied by Urco, his heir, and took refuge in a fortress situated at some distance from the capital. The more standard version of the events that followed may be summarized as follows. Pachacutec, backed by 2 able generals and a stable band of nobles, stood firm, resolved to defend Cusco to the last ditch. The Chancas invested and tried to storm the city. In various accounts, Pachacutec is alternatively portrayed as a human conqueror and legendary hero. In one such version, as the crucial juncture of this tide of fortune turned dramatically at the very stones were transformed into armed warriors at Pachacutec's behest. Thus reinforced, the attack was repulsed. The stones were thereafter collected and placed in the principal shrines of the city. In further encounters, Chanca forces were crushed and retreated from Cusco towards Andahuelas. The 2 leading Chanca generals were killed. Their heads were displayed on lances, and their skulls were made into drinking cups. Pachacutec bore the insignia of the defeated Chancas to his father, Viracocha. According to most accounts, Viracocha then abdicated and Pachacutec ascended the throne as the 10th Inca monarch. Following the Chanca rout, Pachacutec assumed supreme control. According to the principal sources, his reign marked the transformation of the early township into a resplendent capital, the reordering of the priestly hierarchy, and the molding of primordial cults into a dynamic force, the spiritual expression of the Inca will to conquer. The rebuilding in Harin Cusco of the Great Shrine, formerly also the residence of the ruler, was the first task. Coricancha was an imposing enclosure in which the largest building was the Temple of the Sun. Today, walls and broken rooms of the complex survive, forming the shell of the Dominican monastery, though none of the walls existing in the Dominican cloisters today can be identified as proven relics of the Sun Temple. Flanking the Sun Temple were other sacred buildings, housing gods, priests, and mamaconas, the countless temple women, later brought to Cusco from all quarters of the empire and schooled in fine weaving, in the making of chicha, the ritual drink, and in many other sacred tasks. Under his successors, Coricancha was continually embellished, but Pachacutec gave the Temple of the Sun a special aura by placing therein golden statues of the former rulers, splendidly attired and fully armed. A new image of the sun god, Inti, was cast in pure gold. Before this idol, llamas in priceless vestments were burned in sacrifice, while numerous children, both boys and girls, were buried alive in front of the image. The chronicler Juan de Betanzos relates that Pachacutec also adorned the Sun Temple with a second golden statue, the image of a boy who recalled a figure that had miraculously appeared to him on the night before his triumph over the Chancas. When the king prayed before the statue, it reportedly spoke to him. Only the greatest nobles were allowed to venerate this image. Apart from temples, the city was now adorned with imposing palaces, including that of Pachacutec himself. Though its exact location is hard to identify, one palace called Casana is attributed by some to Pachacutec, but is more generally known as that of his grandson Huayna Capac. Pachacutec totally revamped the structure of Sacsayhuaman, the great fortress that dominated Cusco. Its dimensions are, however, so vast as to suggest that its completion was the work of several generations of rulers. The edifice served as the city's main storehouse for arms and clothing, as well as for massive quantities of jewels, gold, and silver later paid in tribute. Pachacutec did not confine himself to rebuilding the city and renovating its infrastructure. His impact on the social fabric of the community was profound. The original Incas, often kinsmen of the ruler, were called orejones, thus named because their ears were pierced with large holes. They were divided into 11 aylus, best described as akin groups with descent in the male line. A major problem, however, arose because these original Incas, or orejones, belonged to the 11 aylus linked by blood ties, were too few in number to meet all the needs of an expanding state. To remedy the situation, Pachacutec relied on an additional class, Incas by privilege, por privilegio, who formed another 10 aylus that also became part of the Cusco establishment. The title Inca by privilege was gradually extended to include many of those who spoke Quechua, drawn from the surrounding region. Pachacutec established a corvée system to provide labor needed for the erection of an imperial capital. Of this, an essential element was the use of mitimes, a procedure that reached major proportions as the empire was expanded. Mitimes consisted of large groups of people, arbitrarily transplanted from regions already subdued, and settled in nearby occupied lands in order to further their adaptation to Inca rule. In return, people from certain regions were settled in the valley of Cusco. As we shall later see in more detail, the mitima system was basic to the Inca method of imperial control. The strange custom prevailed in Cusco whereby the descendants of deceased monarchs form a group known as a panaca, whose mission was to conserve the dead ruler's mummy and to immortalize his achievements. The Panacas might have existed earlier in Inca history, perhaps inherited from Timor, but Pachacutec consolidated the system. He reportedly disinterred the bodies of the first 7 rulers and fashioned mortuary bundles of their remains that were then set on the thrones of the Temple of the Sun beside his own father. Pachacutec's first long-range conquests implied the existence of at least an embryo version of the Inca road system, later to attain such spectacular proportions. It is possible that roads served military purposes in the Wadi period, but the Inca system enjoyed a unique symbolism of its own, with its 4 principal roads radiating from the center of Cusco, dividing both the capital and Tawantinsuyu, as the empire came to be called in 4 quarters: Chinchasuyu, Antisuyu, Colasuyu, and Contisuyu, often wrote as Kandasuyu in the sources. Early conquests. The Inca victory over the Chancas served as a springboard for an explosive territorial expansion, though the gains made by Pachacutec himself as opposed to those of his successors are not easy to define. His first task was to complete the conquest or reconquest of the valley of Cusco and the surrounding region, in which the Incas were now the paramount power. Following the process of consolidation, accounts survive an expedition to Callao, led by Pachacutec in person, in which he encountered the peoples of the Lake Titicaca region. After a hard-fought battle, he took the important center of Hatuncola. The defeated Cola ruler was sent to Cusco and subsequently beheaded. The Lupaca Indians, whose capital was Chucuito, reportedly then also surrendered. Thereafter, Pachacutec visited the great ruins of Tiwanaku. Amazed by fine stonework, he took careful note of the methods of construction, with a view to his own rebuilding of Cusco. The last major campaign of Pachacutec's reign was directed northwards towards Huánuco and led to conquests in the mountains interior of present-day Peru. The general who commanded this expedition was Capac Yupanqui, Pachacutec's brother. However, he advanced beyond Huánuco and occupied Cajamarca. In doing so, he had far exceeded his instructions and, notwithstanding his triumphs, was executed on return to the capital. By all accounts, Pachacutec enjoyed a fairly long reign, during the latter part of which one of his sons, Amaru, was subsequently replaced by Tupac Yupanqui, served as co-ruler. John Rowe, on the basis of a chronology offered by Cabello de Balboa, suggests that he reigned from 1438 to 1471, but Rowe acknowledges that such dates are tentative, since no proven Inca dating system exists. Pachacutec may, according to certain reports, have survived as co-ruler during the first part of the reign of his successor, Tupac, but after the expedition to Cajamarca, he in effect fades from the scene, and both the reins of government and military command were assumed by Tupac. Since Pachacutec presents a dual aspect, as legendary creator and human king, it becomes hard to separate the two and to assess his historical role. If he laid the foundations of a state obtained to rule a boundless empire, some doubts linger as to how far all its institutions really owe their origin to this one ruler. Certain scholars may prefer to stress his semi-divine nature as creator more than conqueror, as a successor to Manco, the original founding father. But while it may be perfectly legitimate to question the traditional accounts of such prodigious achievements, much evidence does suggest that in an historical sense, his reign initiated the expansion of Tawantinsuyu. When he became ruler, the Incas formed only a modest village community. By the time of his death, they had already controlled an expansionist empire. The last emperors. Tupac Yupanqui, the 9th Inca, while not like his father Pachacutec, venerated as a cultural hero, was nonetheless a genial commander. In Inca tradition, his martial skills were legendary. At his death, the Inca ruled a vast domain, stretching for over 3,000 kilometers from northern Ecuador to central Chile. In terms of sheer dominance, this feat bears comparison with the triumphs of Alexander the Great, whose furthest penetration into Asia, achieved with the decisive aid of horses and chariots, brought him to the river Oxus, a distance of some 4,000 kilometers as the crow flies from his home base in Macedon. The chroniclers Sarmiento and Cabello de Balboa give a fairly detailed and in many respects parallel account of the conquest of Tupac and his successor. The much earlier work of Cieza de Leon and the later version of Cobo, in very general terms, offer similar data. According to both Sarmiento and Cabello, in Tupac's first campaign, he took the northward road to Chinchasuyu, occupied Cajamarca, and pressed on to the northwest, reaching as far as Tumebamba, the present-day Cuenca, in Ecuador, the home of the Cañari people, who still occupied the surrounding country. Tumebamba became the northern capital of the empire, a second Cusco, the remains of whose temples and palaces so impressed Cieza on his journey through Ecuador, though few vestiges survived today. Tupac reportedly also conquered the Quito region, but as we shall see, neither chroniclers nor archaeologists accept the notion that Quito ever became the principal Inca center in that region. The four Spanish sources mentioned above concur that Tupac then descended from Tumebamba to the Ecuadorian coast and, proceeding via Tumbes, undertook the conquest of Timor, a major feat of which only the very briefest accounts survive. The ruler was carried off to Cusco and the great kingdom was annexed. Following the assault on Timor, Tupac visited the great shrine of Pachacamac. This was more a ceremonial visit than a conquest, involving a consultation with the famous oracle. The emperor then established control over many ancient principalities situated on the southern coast of Peru, such as Ica and Chincha. At first sight, the notion that such kingdoms should surrender their freedom almost without a fight might surprise. However, due to the ability of the Incas to form large armies by recruiting subject peoples, and hence to achieve a crushing superiority in numbers, resistance in some cases already seemed futile. In addition, in desert regions on the coast, the invaders could deal the defenders a deadly blow and even force surrender by cutting off the intakes of the irrigation canals on which they depended for their food supply. This great series of conquests, reportedly ranging from central Ecuador to southern Peru, was followed by an expedition embracing an even vaster extent of territories, but of which only the most fragmentary accounts survive. Tupac marched southeastwards to Lake Titicaca. He overcame some resistance in Callao, and then forged on and took the important center of Cochabamba, also situated in Bolivia. After a further advance into what is now northwestern Argentina, his campaign ended in Chile where, according to most accounts, the Rio Maule, to the south of the present-day capital Santiago, formed the southernmost limit of Inca conquest. While ethno-historical material on Inca penetration of northwest Argentina is almost non-existent, local sources, such as Jerónimo de Bibar, describe the fierce resistance offered by the peoples of Chile, led by two principal chiefs, Michimalongo and Antalongo. These sources suggest that in Chile, the Inca invaders finally encountered an almost total rejection and had to fight fierce battles to achieve their conquests. But quite apart from cryptic records of such a spectacular series of conquests, in contrast, more copious accounts survive of the rather fruitless but endless struggles by Tupac and his successor against primitive peoples who lived to the east and southeast of Cusco on the hot and humid slopes of the Andes, as they descend eastwards towards Amazonia. While somewhat hollow victories are invariably reported, these campaigns seem to have achieved relatively little, and in a climate so inhospitable to the Incas that they suffered serious losses. An example may be cited Sarmiento's report of how, in one of these arduous forays beyond the Andean peaks, almost the most terrible and fearsome mountains with many rivers, many soldiers died of sickness. Tupac, with these survivors, only a third of the original force, wandered lost in the mountains for many days until rescued by Achachi, a leading Inca commander. The chronicler duly explains that Peru is cool and dry, whereas the montañas, i.e. the eastern slopes of the Andes, are warm and humid. Tupac thereafter returned to Cusco, where he built and adorned great palaces and fortresses. Exhausted by the endless intrigues, he fell sick and would see no more visitors. When about to die, he summoned the nobles, his relatives, and told them that he was about to depart for the house of his father, the sun. Pachacutec, following in his defeat of the formidable Chancas, is generally accepted as the ruler who transformed what was at best a city-state into an expanding empire by means of long-range military expeditions. But Tupac was clearly a genial commander who, according to all surviving accounts, conquered an immense territory stretching from Ecuador to central Chile. The obvious question then arises: how, faced with the formidable difficulties of conducting campaigns at such distances from their home base, did they vanquish and subdue vast numbers of different peoples so remote from Cusco? These peoples were fighting for the freedom of their homelands. They faced no such problems of logistics as beset the Incas and endured no grueling marches to reach the field of battle. But against such opposition, while the Incas reportedly suffered many setbacks, they ultimately prevailed. Moreover, while the Incas profited from their superb lines of communication, scarce evidence exists that they were better armed than their adversaries. Their weapons did not constitute any advance over those of other Andean peoples, and certainly did not impress the Spaniards, who marveled at their roads and buildings. While the sling was also one of their principal weapons, a favorite arm was the club, originally fashioned from stone but later made of hard jungle palm with a head of bronze, a weapon that can still be seen in many museums and collections. Such clubs were hardly effective against the Spaniards, since they had to be lifted above the head to inflict a blow, whereas the Spaniards could dispatch Indian after Indian with lightning sword thrusts. In effect, the Inca armament scarcely presents a very major advance on that of the Moche rulers, whose warriors, depicted on their pottery, also used large clubs 1,000 years earlier, together with slings and spear throwers. Nor can Inca triumphs be easily attributed to superior tactics. They perhaps had the advantage of being nearly always on the offensive against opponents who adopted a rather passive defense and appeared to have taken a few steps to cut the Incas' seemingly vulnerable lines of communication. But while it might be conceded that the Incas, as the attacking force, held the initiative, the chroniclers' reports, particularly those of Cabello de Balboa on the hard-fought Ecuadorian campaigns, suggest that both sides adopted almost identical tactics, often based on a strategy of fortified strong points and aggressive sorties. Inca's success might perhaps be attributed more to the skill and determination of their high command. The rulers were served by generals of unquestioned skill. In many instances, such commanders were close relatives, brothers or sons, and nephews of the king. But sound leadership, let alone weapons or tactics, hardly explained the Incas' dazzling record of victory. Their triumphs are perhaps better explained by their skill in deploying superior numbers at the crucial point by drawing on the manpower of an expanding domain. If the Incas suffered a setback, says in Ecuador, they could use their road and message network to quickly summon reserves of colas and others who were firmly loyal to the empire, while their opponents, worn down by a tide of fresh levies, could not themselves replenish their strength, depleted by the first battles. Hence, Inca conquest might be attributed, at least in part, to their political skill in indoctrinating former foes, now subject peoples, who were by then willing to trek immense distances and risk their own lives for the sake of their previous conquerors. Huayna Capac. As often occurred, the succession was disputed. A plot was hatched, fomented by female intrigues, to supplant Tupac's chosen heir with another son, whom the ruler had formerly proposed as his successor. With the backing of Tupac's brother, the plot was foiled and his designated heir, Huayna Capac, duly mounted the throne. Huayna Capac was still a young man when he became ruler. Having first performed the elaborate funerary rites for his father, he headed for the north on his first campaign. Certain descriptions of his route and objectives on this and other expeditions bear an almost uncanny resemblance to those followed by Tupac. But it must always be borne in mind that our information derives from verbal traditions based on individual memories, leading to possible confusions between one reign and another in the reports of Spanish chroniclers who recorded those traditions. Archaeology at present tells us more about the ultimate extent of such conquests than in the order in which they occurred. After Huayna Capac's first brief expedition to Cajamarca and beyond, by all accounts, the ruler then returned to his capital and thereafter covered in a short time the immense distance between Cusco and Chile, where he fought many battles. Certain reports suggest that he spent a whole year in that region. Departing from thence on his return journey, he first established himself in Cochabamba. To this fertile Bolivian valley he introduced many mitimes or settlers from other parts of his empire to cultivate the rich soil. Cochabamba thus became not only a military bastion, but also a veritable breadbasket for Inca forces in the southern part of their realm. After a pilgrimage to the important shrine of Copacabana, situated on Lake Titicaca, the ruler returned to Cusco. Following this major southward expedition, accounts of the remainder of Huayna Capac's reign dwell upon his endless struggle against the implacable tribes of Ecuador. Reports differ as to the final extent of Huayna Capac's northern conquest, but the available evidence suggests the existence of a rather loose form of frontier, more or less following the present-day border between Colombia and Ecuador. Cabello de Balboa in particular gives a vivid account of the ruler's Ecuadorian wars, which occupied the last 10 years of his reign, offering an almost blow-by-blow description of these campaigns. Cabello himself spent several years in Quito before he completed his book in 1586, and had learned much from descendants of the local chieftains, who surely still cherish the traditions of battles fought by their forebears. To cite a single example of many such encounters, one of Huayna Capac's campaigns was directed against the Caranquis. His description of the final and most dramatic event in that war may serve as a good example of Cabello's lively narrative. For 5 whole days, the Incas attacked a Caranqui fort, but were unable to breach its defenses. A further attempt was then planned, but this was in reality only a feigned assault, and the attacking force retreated with the unsuspecting Caranquis in hot pursuit. Meanwhile, a second Inca force was able to penetrate the now unguarded fort, while a third contingent under the ruler's direct command fell under the Caranques who had made the sortie. Surrounded on all sides, they floundered in a marsh of reeds in which they either drowned or were slaughtered. The locality was henceforth known as Yahuarcocha, the Lake of Blood. It still features on modern maps of Ecuador. Cieza de Leon, when he visited Yahuarcocha, recorded eyewitnesses' descriptions of the slaughter of 20,000 warriors in the Lake of Blood. Having devoted the latter part of his reign to these Ecuadorian wars, Having devoted the latter part of his reign to these Ecuadorian wars, Juan Capac, after a brief visit to the coast, fell sick and died, possibly from smallpox, originally imported by earlier Spanish visitors to the New World, but which may have spread to Peru before the Spanish themselves arrived there. The emperor's servants reportedly sent 2 relay teams to the great shrine of Pachacamac to ask what should be done for the health of their lord. The oracle replied through the mouth of the idol that the Inca should be taken out to the sun and that he would then get well. The advice was meticulously followed, but with the opposite result, for when the Inca was exposed to the sun, he promptly died. The archaeological record. Contemporary archaeological research tells us of less of Inca beginnings, but serves to enrich our knowledge of the scope and extent of Inca conquest, previously based on data derived almost wholly from the written sources. It is now becoming clear after many decades of study that the more standard types of Inca pottery of imperial times, whenever found in any quantity, is a positive indication of the presence of Inca conquerors. Hence, archaeology may be expected to play an ever-increasing role, since much can be learned of the limits of Inca expansion by simply mapping the points where such pottery has been located. If we find Inca ceramics present in a given site but absent from a place, say 20 kilometers to the south, then in many instances, but not always, a tentative border can be established. Much still remains to be done in this respect, and large sectors of the imperial frontier remain ill-defined, particularly in northern Peru and southern Bolivia, where tentative maps may commit errors in that respect. As a good example of current redefinition of frontiers, the coast of Ecuador may be cited, which has traditionally been treated as part of the empire. However, not only in southern Colombia, but also in coastal Ecuador, evidence of an Inca presence is scarce. Inca pottery is notable by its absence, and the persistent tendency of certain chroniclers to describe coastal Ecuador as a province becomes less acceptable. Reported expeditions by Inca rulers to that region were presumably excursions rather than conquests. As another example of revised conclusions, might be cited the area to the west of the Bolivian city of Santa Cruz, which is now considered to have formed part of the empire, following investigation of the site of Samaipata. Equally, some light on the ultimate limits of conquest is shed by the fact that at present the southernmost of Inca remains in Chile so far discovered are the cemetery of Nos in San Jose de Maipo and the fortress of Chena, both situated less than 20 kilometers south of the present-day capital, Santiago. Less well studied, but of great potential utility for the definition of boundaries, are Inca forts. As more of these are located and investigated, they may help define, for some areas, the outermost Inca boundary, as well as earlier limits before subsequent expansion. The chroniclers' account of the Ecuadorian wars frequently mentioned the use of forts. Archaeologists have now confirmed some of these accounts by discovering, for instance, no fewer than 37 fortresses in the northern Ecuadorian Andes, though it is not as yet very easy to determine the identity of the builders of such constructions, where both Inca and pre-Inca pottery have been found. Concerning the Cusco region itself, in earlier times a series of hill sites has been studied in the vicinity of the future Inca capital with Quilca pottery, which may date from as early as AD 1000. One site lies literally within the precinct of the great fortress of Sacsayhuaman, which guarded Cusco. As we have seen above, recent excavations suggest that some form of Inca presence may have been established in the region long before the traditional date for their arrival, though not necessarily localized within the city of Cusco. In many regions, fortifications form such an integral part of the military infrastructure that their importance in Inca times might almost be compared to that of castles in European warfare, in the Middle Ages. While almost no true forts have yet been found in the eastern border regions of Peru, defensive sites have been located in northwestern Argentina, a region for which historical data are scant. It is not yet, however, very clear to what extent these might have been frontier posts. As we have seen, the chroniclers' accounts of the wars of the last two great emperors tend to concentrate on their grueling campaigns fought against the savage tribes of Ecuador, with rather scant reference to other important campaigns. The siege and capture of fortresses in Ecuador are often described in vivid terms. But the location of so many fortresses in the northern Ecuadorian Andes now lends a certain authenticity to the scope of this form of siege warfare as described by the chroniclers, Huáscar and Atahualpa. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they found the Inca realm still in the throes of a convulsion that formed a tragic epilogue to its great achievements. On Huayna Capac's death, a power struggle between rival elements again ensued. A legitimate son of Huayna Capac, Huáscar, was duly enthroned in Cusco, escorted by no fewer than 40 other sons of the late ruler. However, a deep rivalry prevailed between Huáscar and Atahualpa, usually described as an illegitimate offspring of the late ruler. Atahualpa initially made no bid to seize the throne, but the hostility between the two brothers was intensified as the result of the massacre of many of the nobles who accompanied Huayna Capac's body to Cusco and who were supporters of Atahualpa. War ensued in which Huáscar's forces initially triumphed. His general, Atoc, marched northwards to Ecuador, occupied Tumebamba, and captured Atahualpa. The latter, however, miraculously escaped from his prison by drilling a hole in a wall with a silver bar given to him by an important lady who had been allowed to visit him. The Spaniards, alas, were able to prove themselves more efficient as jailers. Following his liberation, Atahualpa assembled a large force and defeated Atoc at Ambato to the south of Quito. Atahualpa's army then marched southwards and fought a series of engagements with Huáscar's forces. Huáscar's own career eventually ended on a tragic note. Awoken from his drunken slumber at midday and warned that Atahualpa's generals, Quisquis and Chalcuchima, were approaching Cusco, Huáscar in person precipitously set forth with a large army. But his leadership was so inept that he was defeated and captured. He was subsequently killed by his escort on Atahualpa's orders. But as we shall later see in our final chapter, Atahualpa's triumph was short-lived. At the very moment when he was celebrating in Humachuco the news of Huáscar's capture, he received the portentous tidings of the landing of a small band of exotic beings who were already marching inland. This concludes Chapter 6.